our company will give a average CT scanner 10 years. However, if that CT scanner is in a busy emergency department running 24/7, it's not going to last 10 years versus a CT that may be in a ambulatory care department outside the hospital that's running 40 hours a week. That's going to last much longer if you compare the two devices. So utilization is a key factor.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
Today on Power Supply, we will speak with Mark Schlesinger, Principal Consultant and Investigator at ECRI. We're going to be talking about capital replacement planning for medical devices. And you might ask yourself, Principal Consultant and Investigator, what does that have to do with capital replacement planning? Well, Mark's going to tell you all about it along with his very interesting background as a respiratory therapist today. And then we're going to give you some tips for making sure that you have got the appropriate 10-year plan and that you're looking at it on a regular basis to make sure that there are no surprises. There's a lot of factors that go into the expected life of a device, and all of that is packed in today's interview. So stay with us. We'll be right back with Mark after a short break.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
Joining me now is Mark Schlesinger, Principal Consultant and Investigator with ECRI, and we're going to be talking about capital replacement planning for medical devices today. And I think this conversation is going to go maybe a little bit different than you might have thought when we start talking about capital planning. I love your job title, Mark, so we're going to dive into that in a second. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, Mark, maybe just give us a little bit of your background. How do you find yourself in your current role at ECRI today?
So I began in healthcare as a respiratory therapist. Way back, I got out of school in 1978. I worked in respiratory therapy until 2014 in many roles. I was a critical care respiratory therapist, mainly specializing in adult and neonatal respiratory care. I moved up the ladder, as they say, a supervisor role, manager, director. My final role was as a senior administrative director for a multi-hospital system in the Philadelphia area over ancillary services. So ancillary services, I pretty much had responsibilities for most of the medical departments, with the exception, of course, of nursing and the doctors.
Well, what an interesting career, especially during the time that you were a respiratory therapist, because I know there were lots of changes in that industry, including, certification. And I would say, and you can correct me if I'm positioning this the wrong way, but almost like legitimization of the profession over the years that you were working as a respiratory therapist.
Yeah, 100%. Respiratory always had credentialing. You were either a certified respiratory technician or a registered respiratory therapist. However, licensure took a long time. So I am from Pennsylvania, and I want to say licensure came about in the mid-'80s. And I believe every state except one state now has licensure, and respiratory is now working on a compact so you can move around between states similar to what nursing can do.
Oh, that's phenomenal. I mean, honestly, like if you want to be able to have people working, in traveling capacities, which we look at workforce shortages and the challenges in that regard, like you really do kind of need that compact state to be able to pull that off, at the scale that maybe we're seeing a lot more of these days. So, well, congratulations on your climb the ladder, and also respiratory therapies climb up the ladder as well. What's also interesting is, so we hear your background and then we hear your title, which is principal consultant and investigator. I think people probably thought you were like a PI at one time, when we hear that, and like, it's so interesting to me. What is it like, and what does it really mean in your role with ECRI as an investigator? What is that?
So I do investigations of medical devices that have failed, usually while on a patient, causing patient harm. So I usually limit myself to devices that I'm very familiar with, such as cardiac devices, of course, ventilators, anesthesia machines, those type of devices. However, I have investigated some surgical devices, such as circular staplers, other devices similar to that. But we do forensic investigations similar to what you would see on TV as a CSI. Many times we go to the actual hospital and we interview staff, etc. Other times the hospital will ship the device to us, to our headquarters, for a forensic investigation of the device.
Well, I'm starting to see how this ties to capital planning, but what just a broad and creative kind of application of your skill set you've kind of found yourself in today. I've known a few people that have done this type of work, but it's really few and far between. I mean, there just are not a lot of investigators out there, are there?
No, ECRI is one of the few companies that actually do this. There are other companies more focused on the engineering aspect, but what ECRI brings to the table is both clinical expertise and the engineering background. And together, it really leads to a very good outcome and discovery of the issue.
So, in the context of capital planning, let's maybe tee up the conversation around, why capital planning, especially around medical devices, is so important. I mean, I don't want to bury the lead too much here as we go through the conversation, but I think when you start talking about issues with medical devices and, if they fail, et cetera, like it's starting to come into picture for me. But let's talk about the business case about why it's so important.
Well, for one thing, capital planning really brings organization to an otherwise unorganized and chaotic process. While I was in the hospital, I used to dread getting the packet. So back then, everything was inter-office mailed. We had email, but it was primitive. And you dreaded it because, for one thing, the smaller departments never really got what they needed. And for another point was it took a lot of time and energy to put together capital requests. They were fully manual. I remember filling them out with paper and pen, submitting them to finance, and then they go to supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. So nowadays, we have the advantage of having many computers assisted systems that can help us, but it's still chaotic. And still, from what I see doing this all the time, the smaller departments really get the crumbs of the money.
Yeah, it's so true. And then, the necessary upgrades, it's almost like you might even skip a generation of upgrades by the time you get the funding, right?
100%, yes.
So what should this planning process look like? And I love the fact that you are bringing up ancillary departments as well as like, okay, we know kind of there are certain departments, the operating room obviously being one that takes a lot of priority in terms of the budget, has a lot to do with the revenue associated for that department. But what should this process look like? Maybe even you could compare and contrast it if you see some differences between, a department that's, highly revenue generating like the OR versus an ancillary department.
Sure. So there are four major service lines that get the bulk of capital funds, and maybe they should. So we have perioperative services, operating room, etc., cardiovascular, laboratory, and imaging. Imaging, I would say, gets the bulk of the bulk. Nothing in imaging, capital wise, is inexpensive. It's not uncommon to spend $1.5 million on an MRI or a CT these days. So, we're really, when we do capital replacement planning, we are truly trying to get the right money into the right hands so that the departments that really need equipment, and they may not be the big departments, can get that equipment.
Yeah, and so how do they plan for this then, right? Like how do they plan ahead for what's going to come? Because I mean, that's a great point. The funding is going to be different, the funding cycle is going to be different. So what do they have to do at that point? Like, I mean, obviously they probably have to start with taking a look at their contracts too, right? Because they may have a maintenance agreement that's built into their capital purchase.
You may have a maintenance agreement that also has upgrading within that. Software upgrades are important. I think the first thing that needs to be done is you need to do a good inventory of your current equipment. We do a lot of these projects, and I can tell you that inventories go from horrible to excellent. We have seen everything. I actually did a project where we're interviewing the staff and we're talking about a CT, and the imaging director said, we haven't had that CT in years. And it just was never taken off the inventory list. And then we come to find out that they have a new CT that was not on the inventory list. And the reason for that is it was still under warranty. So the HTM department didn't look at it, which is rare. I mean, that's the only time something to that magnitude has happened. But you need an inventory to start with. The inventory has to be robust. You need to know what the devices are, when they were purchased is a critical part of the capital planning, because if you don't know when they were purchased, you don't know how long they should last, even as a starting point. And the other part that always helps with the inventory is knowing the usage. For example, our company will give a average CT scanner 10 years. However, if that CT scanner is in a busy emergency department running 24/7, it's not going to last 10 years versus a CT that may be in a ambulatory care department outside the hospital that's running 40 hours a week. That's going to last much longer if you compare the two devices. So utilization is a key factor.
You were talking about, okay, it's really great because you got to have good data. You got to have that data sort of like configured in a consistent way, right? And the inventory piece, man, that can be elusive. But it is gonna. I love the usage point, but also like you just got to know the starting point. Like it's great to know the average life, but if you don't know when that life starts, you got nothing. And so that I'm imagining that can be difficult. But like, I guess it introduces like these like the factors that are going to go into how do you even predict the useful life of a device, right? So, what are some of those?
Well, we always look at, we start with the age of the equipment. However, it is not limited to the age of the equipment. If hospitals do not engage a third party, very often they solely look at the age of the equipment. And as I pointed out, utilization is a huge factor. So we start with the age of the equipment. ECRI has a database going back 45 years with literally millions of data points in that database. And that's how we determine what we call the useful life. And that is the average useful life. As I mentioned, we give a CT scanner about 10 years. However, we give ultrasound 6 years. One of the reasons we accelerate an ultrasound device is the technology changes. The device may be perfectly capable of producing the study. However, the quality of the study is going to be severely reduced.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm just going to call out something that happens all the time, right? All of a sudden, a manufacturer says, "Hey, we've got a new one. We upgrade, and we don't support the old one anymore," right? And then that scenario comes up. Do you factor that into the useful life at all, or like how do you view that scenario? Because I feel like sometimes customers almost get the sense that they're forced to upgrade. I'm not sure that's always the case, but sometimes they're presented with that, and I'm not sure they always know what to do with it.
We always look at the manufacturer's information. Is the device being supported? We use the AMI definition of end of life, which means end of support, end of manufacturer, et cetera, et cetera. However, that is definitely one factor. I always give the example. I'll use a vehicle. Just because Ford decides not to make the Ford Fusion anymore, that doesn't mean it cannot be repaired. Replacement parts are available, third-party replacement shops, etc. And that's the same exact thing with medical devices. There are many, many third-party providers of parts, and you have many, many methods of getting that repaired other than the OEM. So even though we do look at that, that is one of our factors. It is not a major factor in our opinion, unless the replacement parts are no longer available, et cetera, et cetera.
So, I kind of just brought up one of those, I want to say, misperceptions that is a common, or I should say common misperception. I'm sure you have a litany of misperceptions that we could spend an hour talking about, but that's one of the more common ones. Can you think of any other like common misperceptions that people have that can sometimes, throw a little bit of a wrench or, put them in a maybe not the right place to be when it comes to capital planning?
A lot of departments, there's a big difference between need and want. When I was in the hospital setting, different department heads and physicians, more so physicians, would go to a conference and they'd see the latest, greatest CT scanner. I'll pick on imaging. And they come back and they decide, we want this $1.5 million CT scanner. And you'll look at their current devices and they're well within the useful life. And there's really no need to replace it. So just because the latest model may be available, it doesn't mean that every hospital needs that. When you're dealing with high acuity type academic medical centers, it's a different story. Tertiary medical centers, academic medical centers, they usually will spend money on the latest because many times they require it to treat the patients. They are getting the most acute, high acuity patients, and many times they do need the latest medical devices to support those patients compared to a community hospital.
These are just like really great considerations. I think, I love the fact that you already talked about how just because the expected useful life is sort of like, an average or a prediction does not mean that it's the same in every scenario. Like I think you kind of teed that up, but earlier you were talking about that. But can you think of like an example of that? Like can you color that in with like, hey, here's a particular medical device that has a lot of variability in its expected useful life?
Well, one would be a CT scanner,
Okay.
MRCT. However, one of the things we try to do when we do replacement planning is physiologic monitors. It's a fairly mature device at this point, so ICUs always get the top of the line monitors with the largest displays. However, many times we will recommend that their older monitors be relifed to a lower acuity area, such as pre-op, such as post-op areas, such as off-hospital locations that are doing same-day surgery. They still have a lot of life left, but they may not have the technology for high acuity, but that doesn't mean they still cannot be used in other areas.
So let's start talking about the actual planning, right? Like we've kind of set the table here, but I think anybody who's listening to this is going to want to be successful with this planning. So we've given them a lot of things to think about, but let's give them the key ingredients in the process. Like, what is maybe the most important things to be considered and part of their plan when they're thinking about capital equipment replacement planning?
So as I mentioned, you need to start with a good inventory. We use 12 different factors that come up with a score. So we use a raw score, and then that raw score becomes a 0 to 100 factor. So our finished product will give a hospital a weighted score based on those 12 factors. However, the most important part of those 12 scores are quality and safety. We have encountered devices that are unsafe. For example, we were doing a project and we were interviewing some of the perioperative nursing, and they were going like, Biomed has looked at this device multiple times. However, we get shocked regularly from it. Well, that's a problem. Okay. That goes right to the top of the list. Another example, again, in perioperative, was the OR table itself works on hydraulics, and the hydraulic system was failing. So in the middle of surgery, the table would shift, it would lower. So things like that immediately, no matter how old they are, if they can't be fixed, if they tried to repair them multiple times, we will put that right to the top of the list. So, quality and safety of the patient is critical. We then, the other 12 factors are, again, we talked about support. Another important factor is if that device would fail, what is the impact to the organization? There's multiple types of impact. There's financial impact, there's throughput impact, and believe it or not, there's reputation impact. A lot of that depends on what the device is and how many of the devices the hospital has. For example, one example would be sterilizing equipment. Smaller hospitals may only have one sterilizer. If that sterilizer would go down even for a few days, the OR stops. Literally.
Yeah, you're not generating any revenue.
Right. There will be no cases performed. Bringing up the CT scanner again. If you only have one or maybe two CT scanners and your scanner goes down, your emergency department closes essentially. If you have a stroke, if you're accredited stroke program, you have to close, all ER admissions because you're not going to be able to perform a CT in a timely manner, which is part of the accreditation programs.
Mm. Yeah. And like one thing that you just pulled out, you kind of teased it a little bit, but you said you talked to the clinicians, like the people using the device in the operating room. And you mentioned even Biomed, like you might be getting two different stories there. So, is that an integral part of some of this planning is getting in front of the people who are actually using the device?
Yeah, 100%. We like to talk to the actual users, both Biomed, HTM, and the clinical users. I don't like to go too high up on the food chain. For example, the vice president of perioperative at a large hospital is going to have no idea of what is working for his or her staff day to day. So I like to talk to no one higher than manager in that department because they are usually very much in tune with what's working, what's not working, what needs to be replaced, etc.
Yeah, and I can imagine you're then looking at your life expectancy through a new lens.
Right. So when we go into the interviews, we already have a predicted life expectancy. And by doing the interviews with both the clinical and the HTM biomed staff, we fine tune them. There are some times where, and this happens in perioperative a lot, where we think a device needs to be replaced and a manager will say, oh, we bought that for Dr. Jones. He's no longer here. We never use it. It's sitting in a closet. Don't replace it. So it really helps. It pushes money back into the budget that they may not have had before.
I'm thinking about how do you sell that device that you don't need anymore too? Like maybe you can bring some revenue into the organization as you find that out.
Yeah, very, very few hospitals do that. It's interesting.
I know. It is really funny, but yeah, you would think. there'd be
Every
a source of income there.
every OR has a closet of unused equipment from previous physicians.
I
So
used to call it the graveyard. When
yeah,
I used to
exactly,
support sterile processing, I would find
exactly. Yep,
the
exactly.
graveyard, and it would be
Yep.
like, this is like, first off, especially in like a lot more of those, urban hospitals where space is at a premium, I'd be like, this is like 600 square feet. This is a gigantic, it might have even been a former procedure room that they weren't using, that they just stuffed everything in. I'm like, this is 600 square feet that's, going to waste. And then you have all this equipment. Like, and sometimes you'd hear from the hospital, they'd be like, can you just take it out of here? And it's like, well, that's not what I do, but I would imagine somebody does that.
There are companies that will come in and just purchase your used equipment in bulk, and then I don't know exactly what they do with it. It may end up on eBay.
Yeah. All right. So one of the things as we kind of prep up for this that you talked to me about was how important it was to look out a ways, right? You really can't have a near term myopic view of this planning. And I don't think that'll come to anyone's surprise who's listening to the podcast. But you specifically told me that it should be, a 10-year lookout. So, why is the 10-year lookout kind of the sweet spot for this?
Most devices last between 8 and 12 years, I'd say, give or take, again, totally depending on utilization. Some of the exceptions to that are endoscopes. Endoscopic devices are very delicate. They get banged around a lot. They get cleaned, and they have a much shorter lifespan. The other devices that I have found that have a short lifespan are ultrasound transducers. They get dropped, they get banged on the side of the machine, etc. And then ultrasound machines themselves, I mentioned that before, because of the technology, a 5-6 year old device most likely needs to be replaced because of the technology. And if it's a true point of care device, it's probably not even going to last that long because it's really banged around a lot.
Yeah, I'm thinking flexible scopes and ultrasound. Like I can really resonate with that. And when you talk about, variables that impact the expectancy of the life, like you just think about how they're transported, how are they stored, in so many cases that's an area I definitely had some experience in, in a previous life. And it was like, you had some facilities that, could really keep those devices going, but they had taken, the right precautions to prevent damages to the scopes and the ultrasound, whereas others, there were cases, I don't know if this happens anymore, but there were cases where people were just taking the flexible endoscope and throwing it in a bag and transporting it, to wherever they were going to reprocess it. And it's like, man, there's so many things that can happen to that device just while it's going from point A to point B that are going to have a great deal of impact on your, just your spend on the repair budget, but then also how long is that device actually going to last if that's how you treat them?
Yeah, I'm actually guilty of that. We did a lot of fiber optic bronchoscopies, and we would transport them down to processing in one of those plastic bags that they use for sterilization. So I was guilty of that myself.
It was pretty common practice, but I think it was also common practice when we didn't have such tight budgets like we do today. So, over that 10-year plan, though, this is like, adjacent to what we were just talking about, but there are other things that can come up in the 10 years that can change that outlook. So it's not like, oh, hey, we set this up 10 years ago and we feel pretty good about it and now it's done. What are some of the things that can pop up, kind of midstream?
Well, one of the big things that comes to mind is changes in technology. We don't know what's coming out, in 2-3 years from now. There could be, quantum leaps in many different technologies. A lot of technologies, being a respiratory therapist, I'll pick on ventilators. Ventilators are a very mature device these days. They may improve the interfaces or the displays, but they're mature versus a lot of the imaging devices where AI is coming into play. AI in imaging is huge, and that would be a real reason to accelerate a replacement for major equipment with AI.
All right. So with that in mind, how often should we be updating the plan, right? It's a 10-year plan. Does the 10-year plan reset every year, or do you have a 10-year plan and then, you revisit it at a certain interval, and then you're extending the 10-year plan whenever you're reviewing it? Like, how, give me a little more of the minutia in that.
We recommend updating the plan every 1 year. When we do that, it's fairly easy and inexpensive. We just need a file from the HTM department of devices that were replaced and a file with what devices they were replaced with. From that, we generate a new 10-year plan. So truly, the big cost is in the beginning. The yearly updates are fairly inexpensive. We have found that most hospitals replace about 8% of their capital medical devices every year. That's a lot if you think about it. It's 8 to 10% is a large chunk, which means that even a year or two out, if you have not updated your plan, it's going to be not accurate, to say the least.
Yeah, you haven't kept your eye on necessarily how it's influenced by new technology. You might acquire a hospital, which totally changes the inventory, which you said is kind of like the number one piece of information that you need to build this. You could have a change in the types of your procedures that you're doing in certain areas. We've seen a big shift in procedures moving to, outpatient. Exactly. And so, if you're capital planning, your budget and your planning around that is really only for the acute space, an inpatient, then all of a sudden, that's going to change a great deal. And the inventory may even be shifting from an inpatient department to an outpatient center. And then, have you really kept up on that in terms of, you've got to now have two different budgets if they're not rolling up under the same one, and you've got to plan accordingly. So I love that. I think the every year is definitely the best way to do it.
I agree. Mergers and acquisitions, I'm glad you brought that up. That is a huge need to do capital planning, because you purchase a hospital, they are most likely going to have different vendors in their location than the hospital that acquired them have. You really want to standardize devices as much as possible. And when I say standardize, similar devices with the same vendor, because there's so much cost savings, everything from purchasing power to contract negotiations. You're going to save money in training your clinical staff. You'll save money with service contracts, etc. So mergers and acquisitions is a definite need to do capital planning.
All right, Mark, this has been a great conversation. I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I also want to give you an opportunity. Is there anything we didn't mention during the discussion today that really got to leave with the folks that are listening in?
I think the big thing with capital planning is, speaking from someone who ran all the little departments, you have to give a fair amount to even the smaller departments, because they have devices that are often life support devices that, you're not going to put up a billboard that you're buying a new infusion pump or a new ventilator versus a new surgical robot. But medical devices, like devices in your house, fail. And the whole idea of capital planning is you want to be able to replace them before they fail, not too early, but not too late, so that they fail.
That was Mark Schlesinger, Principal Consultant and Investigator at ECRI, talking about capital replacement planning for medical devices. I really love this interview today. I think just talking around, what's the impact on the organization if there is a device failure? In some cases, your capital planning isn't just about replacement. It's about making sure that you have the necessary backup to continue to deliver the patient care that is scheduled on a day in and day out basis. I also appreciated the way that he viewed ancillary departments versus maybe some of those main departments like the operating room that drive so much revenue and often don't come with the same challenges for capital planning because maybe they have access to those capital funds that some of the ancillary departments do not. So Mark has just such an interesting background. I appreciated his insights today. And on behalf of Hayes and Gary, who weren't able to join me today, I want to thank you all for listening to this episode of Power Supply.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.